Today I'm going to be discussing the information for the idea that we've been visited by ancient astronauts in the past. Many of you might be familiar with the work of Eric von Daniken or Zachariah Sitchin, main proponents, people who have been putting out the idea that all the ancient cultures and the knowledge that they gained wasn't just through the natural progression of evolution and time, that we were actually influenced, and that, if you want to call them star beings, people from the heavens, have influenced our primitive cultures and even up to this day. So just going around, what I'll do is kind of explain my own interest and how I got started in this field just briefly. As a college student, I became very fascinated with the possible artificial structures on Mars and NASA's explanation for these images, which then led me to start to look at all the other megalithic monuments all over the Earth, like Stonehenge and, of course, our famous Giza, where the Sphinx and the pyramids are located, but many other archaeological sites around the world, again, showing some interesting stuff with Egypt, which I'll leave up to Mr. John Anthony West to fill you in on today. But many of these megalithic structures all over the world displayed a type of brilliance or a technology that we today still cannot even duplicate. For instance, these stones that we're looking at here, these were stones quarried in Baalbek in Lebanon, and you can see that, I believe that's Ted actually, isn't it? Yeah. So that's Ted standing there on this stone, and these are called trilithoton stones. These are stones that weigh in the thousands of tons range, and you can see that they were quarried here and then taken 5 miles away and stacked. Here's another picture of a gentleman standing there, and they were stacked perfectly here. Now, we don't have technology today, even today, that can cut that precise of a block and wedge something in there and lift it out and take it 5 miles away. So it's very interesting that we have this type of evidence all over the world, and for me it started to really raise the question as to, okay, well, if we don't attribute technology and high mathematics and science to some of these primitive cultures, where do they get this knowledge from? So that starts to lead into the questions that many of the things that are looked upon as mythology, these stories that have been passed down from ancient cultures, are these myths, or did this stuff actually take place? So where this led me to was the very first culture we have record of on Earth, and this was called Sumeria, also known as Mesopotamia and Babylon and various ensuing periods. But the first culture that we have record of came out of modern-day Iraq, then called Sumeria 6,000 years ago. And what's so amazing about the Sumerian culture is it's literally one of the most advanced cultures we have record of, and they come right out of the Stone Age. And so we really have this track record of evolution of civilizations kind of going up and down and up and down and to the point where we are now. But the very first culture that we have record of was the Sumerian culture. Now, the Sumerian culture, again, as I said, located in Iraq. If you look here, this is a little map of what was then called Mesopotamia. This fertile strip of land here now is now known as Iraq, between the Tigris and Euphrates. And the Sumerian culture were the first, they invented over 100 of the firsts for a civilization of high society to take place. Many of the things that they invented and were the first ones to show evidence of being using these things that we'll discuss, they're the first ones to come up with this. Some of that being math, science, medicine, astronomy, astrology even. All of these originated in Sumeria. Here, another thing that originated in Sumeria was, of course, writing. And this is a tablet where they wrote, unfortunately we can't see it that clearly, but what it was called is cuneiform writing. And the cuneiform language of the Sumerians consisted of over 400 characters. They'd use a wedged-shaped object and twist it and turn it and make all these lines and symbols consisting of over 400 characters. So obviously we wouldn't be able to have writing or any of the things without this first development of this system. Sometimes the Sumerians would also write on semi-precious stones, marble, granite, even sometimes gold, to pass down very sacred information. And the knowledge that the Sumerians had, specifically, for instance, just of mathematics alone, this is a diagram here. This is actually a diagram shown in one of Zachariah Sitchin's books. Zachariah Sitchin is a linguist, about 82 years old now, and has spent the last 50 years researching the Sumerian lexicon of information. So this diagram just shows the fact that the Sumerians had very accurate knowledge of geometry and algebra and could do very small equations in very large areas, like we see here, very complex shapes. They were the first ones to denote 360 degrees in a circle, and all of the mathematics bequeathed by the Sumerian culture we still use today. And interestingly enough, they had a base math of 60. Again, being able to do very complicated, fine-tuned, small calculations in very large numbers as well. You'd think it'd be 10 or 5, but no, actually it was a hexadecimal system of 60. Very complicated. So again, the knowledge that the Sumerians had has been further authenticated with all the artifacts that they've left us. These are artifacts which I'm going to be showing which are still stored in the British Museum and the Louvre in Paris. Yes, can we focus that? That's a good question. But while Ted's working his magic there, we'll kind of continue on. This is a tablet, one of several held in the British Museum. And the Sumerians were very astute in recording not only their daily events, but their interaction with what they called their living gods, and as well as just all the various activities that were taking place in their time. They had what they called cylinder seals, and I'll show you a description of one in a moment, but it was kind of like your modern-day printing press. They would take this little cylinder seal and carve a reverse imprint. Yeah, they still don't know how they did this today. They still don't know. They carved a reverse imprint on this little seal and then would roll it out in wet clay, leaving the positive imprint, and so they could roll out these little clay tablets, stick them in a kiln, firing them with heat, making it into stone, and they could disseminate all these little tablets throughout the village very quickly to get out information. This one tablet that we're looking at here basically just describes natural weather occurrences and patterns of storms and observations over hundreds of years that they recorded these events, meaning it wasn't just kind of like a day or two or a week. They were very accurate, in over hundreds of years recorded this knowledge. This is another tablet that shows at what points in certain times of the year different star constellations would be in the sky, which I'll discuss more in a moment, but very interestingly, the Sumerians were the first ones to divide the heavens into 12 parts, which we now know as the 12 houses of the zodiac. Those constellations that you see for each house of the zodiac, the Sumerians were the first ones to originate this information. And here's another tablet that shows observations of Venus. And again, this is over 4,000 years old, and this is the information that they have recorded on stone and is unchanged to this day. So you start to kind of wonder, wow, this is pretty interesting, elaborate writing system, talking about some pretty esoteric things having to do with space. How did they learn all this? Which we'll discuss in a moment. Now here is a cylinder seal. This is a little round, semi-precious stone, and I'm sorry this isn't clear for you folks, but what would happen is they would roll it out on the clay and get the positive imprint. What we're kind of seeing here, and I do have some clearer ones in a moment, but these are what the Sumerians called Anunnaki, and it's the term that they gave to their gods that lived among them. Anunnaki means those who from heaven come to earth. Now I'm going to state real quickly here that all the information I'm about to show you, or that we're going to be seeing, the Sumerians were the first ones of the Sumerians were the originators of many of the biblical tales, many of the stories that we now have in English in the Old Testament or in Hebrew from the Old Testament version and the New Testament version. All of these stories can be transgressed to the first original Sumerian version still in stone. A Noah's Ark, a great flood, the 7 days of creation, all of that are proponents that actually came from the original Sumerian information, which I'll show you here in a minute. So here is another semi-precious stone that shows a Sumerian king talking to another Sumerian. And interestingly enough, we see some symbology here of a winged disc and a crescent moon, which we'll be discussing in a moment. But if this was a little clearer, you could see that this is all writing throughout here, telling a very esoteric story, and they were very detailed with their information. So aside from just the normal daily events that they recorded, they also had interaction with their living gods, which they memorialized in many different artifacts and in little statues. This is the back version that we're looking at of one of the gods named as Ishtar, also known as Inanna in preceding cultures. I will also note that many of the artifacts I will show you come from either Assyrian or Persian, but all of the ancient Semitic languages, Canaanites, Hittites, all of these ancient cultures that we have record of, the Sumerian culture was the first one, and that's what influenced all these other cultures. So when we look at this idea of the Sumerian knowledge of beings coming down from the sky, or this idea that we have in the Bible, giants upon the earth, at one time there are stories in the Bible that man lived among his living gods, and in the English version this gets translated, the story is to there was once a time after the Great Flood there were giants upon the earth, before the flood as well. So interestingly enough, here we have a Sumerian tablet that's basically 2500 BC, 4,500 years old, and it's showing a Sumerian Anunnaki seated, and you see the Sumerian men coming up and greeting him, and they're rising up, a symbolic reference of the sun. And very interesting, as depicted, the Sumerian king, or the Anunnaki, if you will, is much larger than the average workers. So here's another interesting image where, just like we have in the Bible, the English version that Adam and Eve were tempted to not eat the fruit from the tree of life. Well, here's a Sumerian description from 4,000 years ago that shows two Anunnaki standing beside what was known as the tree of life, and a symbolic reference of some type of winged craft, because as you can see, there is a gentleman flying this craft. Now, is this just mythology? Are they just saying that they saw something in the sky and they were trying to describe what it was? I think when we look at this information with a new perspective, in the fact that if these were, stone-wielding, living in a clay hut, primitive civilization, and they saw, let's say, beings coming down from the heaven or strange craft in the sky, they wouldn't know what to call them. They would call them gods. Not today. We have technology, and especially with the people in this room, we have a little bit broader understanding for what could have been taking place back then and is still happening today. So here's another description of Sumerian Anunnaki, and I believe this is actually an Assyrian wall drawing, but all of the information, again, from these cultures was all picked up from the Sumerian culture originally, meaning the Sumerians were the first ones to have these depictions and all of the translations describing what took place when they had interactions with these beings. Another thing to denote is that you'll see that the Anunnaki is holding the fruit of life and the water of life. Just like Adam was told not to eat the apple or the fruit of life, this symbology is all represented in the original Sumerian form, recorded in stone, unchanged. Here's another version of an Anunnaki, a little bit clearer. Again, you can see the very genetically sound physique, I guess, if you will, and the idea that they are, again, using symbology to show that things were taking place back then that the Sumerians are being told, don't do this, follow these laws, don't follow these. And all of this information has been translated into various versions that we have now in Hebrew and English. Another description of the Anunnaki holding a deer, and this elaborate inscription, if we could see it, would clearly explain what is happening. But the Sumerians, again, were very articulate in explaining their daily lives and events. And when British scholars in the early 1900s started excavating artifacts from Iraq, they find things with Anunnaki, these winged beings, or actually descriptions of the planets, which we discussed a moment ago, of Venus and stuff. They didn't quite understand what the Sumerians were discussing. And so all of this information went into a big pile called the myth pile and was untouched by modern archaeology. So again, this name that I mentioned, Zechariah Sitchin or Eric von Daniken, Chariots of the Gods, you might have been familiar with that. These are, there's only a handful of scholars who have chosen to look at this information outside of the mainstream understanding of archaeology and start to question, did these events really take place, or is this just some mythology that this culture is making up? I say it's something that actually took place. So when we look at some of the modern symbology used, for instance, with the Apollo 11 astronauts, it starts to give us a little bit of a clearer picture for what the Sumerians might have been using, saying the Anunnaki had wings. Obviously, they probably weren't birdmen, as many of the archaeologists like to classify them. Here's the same symbology being used by our Apollo space program. Obviously, we weren't landing birds on the moon. We were using symbolic representation that we had the power of flight, just like the Sumerians were showing with the Anunnaki. So here's a little interesting video clip that shows the first launch of Apollo 11 when we went to the moon. And if you'll remember that the first words uttered by Neil Armstrong when they got there was, Houston, the Eagle has landed. So, this symbology being used to denote the power of flight doesn't seem so far-fetched when we look at it in the terms of just using a symbolic reference of someone having the power of flight. So the ancient symbology, again, of the Anunnaki compared to what we know of, today and the idea of extraterrestrials, it starts to make a little bit more sense as to what they were saying when we look at these descriptions in a new light. Another amazing revelation with the Sumerian information is the idea that something happened to cause a great flood, and there was a story in English that we know of Noah's Ark. Well, interestingly enough, held in the British Museum. And I will point out also, since a lot of people who might be aware of this information, it's not just Zecharia Sitchin or Eric von Daniken, a couple of, let's just say, UFO more slanted researchers saying that, oh, this is all information that was held in the Bible. No, these are actual stories, and these translations, if you could read them, are all provided by other scholars in mainstream archaeology, most of them from the British Museum. Samuel Kramer, M.E.L. Malone, and this translation of this artifact is called the Flood Tablet. It's on display in the British Museum as the Flood Tablet, and it clearly describes a story of how an Anunnaki chose to choose a certain Sumerian and bequeath him knowledge that this event was going to take place, and to build a huge craft, a ship, and to save the life of all the animals on the planet, if you will. Now, Zecharia Sitchin has theorized that, we see in the English version like 2 by 2 the animals, but it's very possible that just like the Sumerians had this knowledge that the Anunnaki were their gods, it's very possible that the Anunnaki, if you will, these beings that bequeathed the Sumerians all this knowledge, could have somehow made, the DNA sequencing or the test tube babies of many of these creatures and then store it in a way so that you have the genetic code of these creatures to then reinstate after a calamitous event such as a great flood. Just an interesting side note, but here we have on display the actual flood tablet from the Sumerian culture, the original version of the flood story. So it starts to raise a question, and when we look into the idea of, angels in the Bible and then the Nephilim in Hebrew, where is heaven exactly? I mean, in English it just says heaven. They come from heaven. Where is heaven? That really was a question that I wanted to have answered, being raised as a Christian. So interestingly enough, we have a Sumerian a Sumerian tablet. This one is 4,500 years old, and it's showing the Anunnaki god bequeathing man the plow, the modern age of agriculture. But very interestingly, as a backdrop to this seal, a 4,500-year-old seal in stone, we see our complete solar system with the sun in the center. And we did not know that the sun was in the center of our universe. We thought Earth was the center. All the way up through Galileo and Copernicus, not until the advances of modern science did we realize, wow, we actually orbit the sun. The Sumerians describing that perfectly, accurately, 4,500 years ago. And just to give you an idea of what the Sumerians knew as far as it comes to our solar system, they depicted a solar system with 12 members, not just 9. They counted the 9 planets that we know of, plus the sun, our moon, and then an additional planet called Nibiru, which meant planet of the crossing. And now this planet and the stories behind it are very interesting because the Sumerians very clearly described that these beings, the Anunnaki, their living gods, came from this planet called Nibiru. And again, let's keep that number in our head, 12, because the Sumerian knowledge of 12 planets in our solar system, you'll see some more of that symbology, how it's been filtered down today. Interestingly enough, if you're hip and cool, we think that we live on the third rock from the sun, but it's actually, if someone were coming into our solar system, coming from Pluto in, you'd start over here where Pluto is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and Earth would be the 7th planet. The Sumerians called Earth Ki, the 7th planet. And why did they call Earth the 7th planet? Because the Anunnaki, when they came and visited us, said, you're on the 7th planet. And this whole idea or the notion, just some quick symbology, the 7th planet, well, the 7 days in a week, the 7 days of creation, the 7 days of creation, the Sumerians had 7 tablets of creation, which I'll show you one of them in a moment. But this story hollowed out in the English version of the Epic of Creation, 7 days of creation. The Sumerians have a counterpart, the original version, 7 tablets of creation. So there we go, the sacred number 7. So here's another tablet which Zecharia Sitchin likes to use frequently in many of his lectures. This is a tablet which, as translated by Zecharia Sitchin, shows the path that the Anunnaki took from Nibiru, bless you, to Earth. And so here, as I've circled, is the section that Zecharia Sitchin decided to translate specifically. And it shows some very interesting information. What it shows here is that this is some Sumerian writing explaining that the god Enlil went by 7 planets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, from Nibiru to our vicinity of the solar system where Earth is. And here are actually names of the planets like Mars and Jupiter. Now they didn't call them that. They had Sumerian names for them, but which I'll show you in a minute. Very interesting. The Sumerians not only described the distance between our outer planets, but what they look like in space. How did they know that? We didn't know until we sent the Pioneer and Voyager probes yet it confirmed the Sumerian information from thousands of years ago with what they had said about it. And again, here along the sides, something like rocket, rocket, mountain, mountain, pile up, high, high, high. So this is some pretty interesting information when we start to look at all of these artifacts in detail and wonder, wow, how did they know all this? So again, as I was saying, that when we sent these outer space probes in the 70s, like the Voyager and Voyager 1 and 2 and Pioneer, when it got to the outer part of the solar system and started looking at the planets and taking pictures, they precisely matched the Sumerian information from thousands of years ago. So that's some pretty esoteric information that we can now confirm with our own advances in modern science. So here are some Sumerian descriptions, just some imprints. And this is a cylinder seal recreation, which shows, or a reprint, I should say, which shows during daylight time, these are Sumerian workers, working with a plow and some animals. And interestingly enough, the symbology of Nibiru, right, this planet where the Anunnaki come from, this is a scene saying that they could even see this planet during the day, that there was a time when this planet would actually come near to us and would be a big red glowing cross in the sky. Interestingly enough, that they depicted this planet Nibiru originally as a big glowing cross, because Christianity with Jesus on the cross, well, this is 4,000 years before Christianity, and they're symbolizing their gods as a cross, or that they come from a cross. Oh, let me back up too, and I should say that these other symbols, in pursuing cultures that led even into the Egyptian culture, this sign for Nibiru was translated more into the winged disc, which we'll see more of here in a minute. So here's another Sumerian cylinder seal, and interestingly enough, as a backdrop, we have the 7 dots here that represented Earth. I'm sorry that this isn't clear for you. This is the 7 dots that represented Earth. This is the winged disc of Nibiru. And the Sumerians had many, many tablets and many, many cylinder seals which describe daily events of when they lived among their living gods and the things that took place. Here's another cylinder seal, an imprint, when you pressed it into the clay, that left the symbol for Nibiru, its crescent moon, the 7 dots of Earth, and our crescent moon. I don't exactly know what the meaning of this is, other than those are the 2 symbols that it's showing us, and it's, pretty interesting. So here's another Sumerian depiction of showing that a seated Anunnaki on the throne here, and symbolically the planet X, if you will, which we'll discuss in a moment. That's another modern term for this planet Nibiru, known by the ancients, depicted as a cross. Even at daylight time, they were able to see this planet. So one of the other stories that the Sumerians give us is basically an ancient cosmology for how our Earth came to be. Now, we understand that basically our solar system is roughly 4.7 billion years old, and the current model, which still doesn't answer all the questions scientifically, but the current model is that all of our planets kind of basically were whimsing in this gas and then slowly coalesced here to make different planets. Well, the Sumerians have another version of our solar system explaining how our Earth came to be. They clearly describe, and actually here is the tablet that explains all this. Like I said, there were 7 tablets that explained the creation of Earth and of man and of the solar system, all these great events, the 7 tablets of creation. This is just one of them, known as the Epic of Creation, and it's stored in the British Museum, and very clearly describes the Sumerian version of how there was this intruder planet, basically, as the Sumerians described it, Nibiru. I've labeled it Planet X here, which we'll discuss in a moment, modern-wise. But this planet, as they called it, an intruder, was pulled into the inner part of our solar system by the gravitational effect of the outer planets, got pulled into the inner part of our solar system. Here's our primitive Earth, which was then known as Tiamat. The Sumerians called our primitive Earth Tiamat. So this intruding planet, Nibiru, when it came very close to Earth, one of its moons, North Wind, as it's labeled here, whacked our primitive Earth, and in the process strewed out the asteroid belt. So many of the theories are still abound as to how the solar system was formed and how the asteroid belt got there. Theories like it was once a planet that exploded. Okay, so where is it now? So here's a Sumerian description of, this is, I'm sorry, a 3D image, but this is the Sumerian description of what took place. And they say that after this collision took place, this Nibiru went on to have a very long orbit of 3,600 years, but forever becoming a member of our solar system. Now, very interestingly enough, if some of you are aware and have been following the as I like to call it, misinformation and speculation on the internet, there's been a lot of information that says that this planet X has been found or is being imaged or is sighted and is coming to cause global catastrophes. Well, just showing a simple equation here that if the orbit is 3,600 years, which by best guesstimates we can confirm by the Sumerian information, a 3,600-year orbit, and roughly 4.7 billion years ago is when our solar system came to be. If we just do a simple division, you can see that 3,600, the orbit of Nibiru, divided by 4.7, the creation of our solar system, we're talking over 1,000,000 times that 3,600-year orbit has been completed. So I theorize that it's possible that not every time this Nibiru passes by us that it causes global catastrophes. I personally do not see any information as of yet to say that Nibiru or a planet X is headed this way, but there is current research to support the idea, both modern and as I'm showing you ancient, that it does exist. So if this planet X or a Nibiru did whack our primitive Earth, making it into half a planet, we do have a theory known as Pangea that states that very early on, all of the continents were connected in one large landmass, and that over time, millions of years, the theory of continental drift, like the skin of an apple, it's kind of come apart and has been slowly drifting into the parts that they are now. But if you were to put all these pieces together, it does show it to be half a planet. And the Sumerian descriptions for how this all took place fits right into the line of thinking that we're still using today of modern science, of this idea of a Pangea and that all the continents do fit. And if it was just one big land mass, a big chunk, well then that whole open basin, it's half a planet, because if you siphon off the water, it's just one chunk of land. So maybe because of hyperdimensional physics or however it works with gravity, all planets siphon into a spherical shape. But without the water, it would just be half a planet. And another very interesting revelation was, just a couple of weeks ago, I'm looking on the Discovery Channel, and here's one of the latest models they're trying to describe for how our how our moon was formed. And it's called the Orpheus Theory. And very clearly, they describe a rogue planet enters our solar system, whacks our primitive Earth, and in the process of doing so, coalesces to make our moon. Eventually, all these fragments would then coalesce to make our moon. So that is, again, another almost confirmation of what the Sumerians were saying, that there was this initial collision with this Nibiru and our primitive Earth, which then created the asteroid belt, and forever making our solar system now with 12 members, and this planet being on a very highly elliptical orbit. So if we ever do find this other planet, it will be very interesting to denote that there might be ancestors of ours actually living there. So this search for a planet X, it takes us into today's modern science, and you'll note that many of the stories being told about this, as I mentioned, are based on information that we can confirm. The idea that there is a planet X within our solar system basically first started in the early, modern-wise, started in the early 80s by the research done by a Dr. Robert Harrington. He was the lead astronomer for the Naval Observatory in Washington, and he went on film with this researcher, Zecharia Sitchin, explaining that he was looking for another planet within our solar system. He called it the 10th planet, not the 12th planet. But based on the long elliptical orbit of this planet and his information, it was right along the same lines of this information for a Nibiru, an ancient planet X. And very interestingly enough, I try and do my best to stay abreast of the latest advances with our space imaging technology. And we had a satellite just launched last month called the Space Infrared Telescope Facility that is going to go out there and do very specific imaging on coordinates looking for brown dwarfs, failed stars, or if you will, a planet X. And I spoke with one of the lead astronomers, Dr. Michelle Fowler. I attended a conference at the Jet Propulsion Laboratories in Pasadena where I, of course, asked her point blank, do you believe in this idea of a planet X? Is it possible? Could it be out there? Would we see it? And she said, yes, this CERTIF will be looking for objects, extrasolar objects within our own solar system, but one of the theories that originally first got this idea going was when in the early 80s, Dr. Robert Harrington started to do research, and basically what he did was looking at the outer planets, he noticed that the outer planets were being pulled in a certain direction, which led him to believe that there's something still out there, meaning when we found Uranus, there was this tug still being exerted on the planets in a certain direction, so they went out and found Pluto, And it was only in 1930 that we found Pluto. But once we found Pluto, we still said, wow, there's an influential pull taking place on the planets that we can't account for. So they said we must still look beyond Pluto for this planet X, Roman numeral 10, 10th, but also X unknown, because the gravitational influences are affecting the inner planets, so it must be there. But where is it? Unfortunately, that model has been a little bit outdated now. The current research tends to suggest that the perturbations, this anomalous pull, they don't know what's accounting for it. So as far as a planet X and trying to locate it, they've really stuck more towards infrared astronomy, looking with very advanced space telescopes for heat signatures. Excuse me. And just to show that some of the latest research that is taking place, these are some articles that were covering this in today's modern science, that there is something out there. Pluto has a far-out peer, or that there's possibly a 10th planet within our solar system. A mystery revolves around the sun. All of this information is going on today with current searches to prove that there is something out there, and that the more and more we look deep into space, it's not a question of being able to locate a planet X, but being able to identify it. Because when we go out with these new advanced satellites and snap a picture, we might see a star field that contains 3,000 planets, from stars and planets, from brown dwarfs to white dwarfs, failed stars, and it's very hard to catalog all of these planets. And so what modern astronomy does now today is they take astronomical plates of the sky. When they snap an image, they can then correlate every known planet that they know of, and then that leaves the other candidates to be possibly new discoveries, or, if you will, a planet X. So that's really the main struggle right now, is to try and determine all of the information that's taken by these satellites, which stars are unknown to us and which ones are possible candidates for Planet X. I must say also that I will be discussing in my workshop, got to save the juicy stuff for the other talk, that I do have a lot of information coming out of mainstream science which does confirm and shows very clearly that NASA, even though it might be called never a straight answer in some cases, but the National Aeronautics Space Association does have an interest in this information and is aware of this knowledge. And so if we do actually find this planet, it will be very interesting to see what takes place. I think I ran through this a little bit quickly, but this is kind of where I was going to end it, and just saying that tomorrow morning at between 8:30 and 10:15 I will be discussing more of the esoteric understandings for this idea of a planet X, and that if we do actually find it, we might have ancestors that come from this planet, which I'll discuss deeply tomorrow. The Sumerian information for these beings, the Anunnaki, is very well documented, and we have thousands of artifacts on display that clearly denote their daily activities. I venture to, over the next couple of years, hopefully gain access to some of these collections. Many of you might have seen the movie The Raiders of the Lost Ark. At the very end, they are wheeling the Raiders. They're wheeling the Ark way into this room where there's just thousands of boxes. That's not too far-fetched from the realistic thing of what's going on. Turns out the British Museum has thousands of these cylinder seals and tablets that are not on public display. Many of them are because they do not understand the information that is being listed. So when we take a new look at some of this information and shed new light onto it, it really does start to answer some questions and raise some eyebrows. I personally, in my effort to understand this information, I hired a professional antiquities photographer, meaning you can't just go into the museum and take pictures of these amazing artifacts. This gentleman is allowed to do that. So I hired him to go to the British Museum in London, the British Museum and the Louvre in Paris, and he took over 500 digital images of just artifacts that I'm specifically interested in, having to do with the Anunnaki and the Sumerian knowledge of Nibiru and the solar system. And I've created a digital archive which I store on my website, xfax.com. Do I have it listed here? I didn't even put my website on the slide. That's okay. You can just do a search on the internet for Jason Martell, but I've created a catalog of over 500 images having to do with the Sumerian culture. And this is important because we just had a war in Iraq. Many of these artifacts that are still stored there, some of them got broken and destroyed. It's not good. And so for us to learn the legacy of our ancient cultures, we need to preserve that information. So hopefully in the next couple of years, my quest is to shed more light on this idea of ancient astronauts and put to test the theories of mythology and say, what if these are events that actually did take place? Thank you very much.